Thank you all for joining us for live Q&A with Anna Sackmann and Erin Foster from UC Berkeley's Research Data Management team and Chris Hoffman from the Research IT unit. This session is a complement to the bite-sized lunchtime talk you've already watched. I'm going to introduce Kevin, a recent UC Berkeley graduate who will introduce our team from Berkeley. Kevin, take it away.
Yeah, so Anna is the data service librarian, Erin leads the Research Data Management program, and Chris Hoffman is the Associate Director of Research IT.
So let's jump right in and get started. I am delighted to have colleagues from Berkeley with us. Y'all know how much I love being a bear. Go Bears. I know Renee and Daniel are out there too. So go Bears, go Bears, go Bears. So why don't we just, I want to turn it over to you because I heard y'all have a question for the audience before we jump into our Q&A. Leave it to Berkeley to be innovative.
We do have a question for everyone. Thank you so much for having us this morning. So we know it's Friday at the end of June. We're kind of in summer mode. So we wanted to do a short activity to kind of get you thinking about your data, get you warmed up a little bit. So I am going to share my screen. And everybody should be able to see pictures of animals. So during the pandemic, Erin and I have been blessed with the presence of Books the cat and June the greyhound. So we would like you to channel your inner Books or your inner June, whether you're a dog or a cat person, and tell us how you're feeling about your data today. If I can get my slide to advance. Okay, so we have 4 pictures here. And if you could please enter in chat how you're most feeling about your data. You don't want to deal with it, you're ready to dig in. Kind of this vibe of like, but do I have to? Or I'm intrigued, let's go. So go ahead and take a minute, figure out which animal you most identify with, and then how you're feeling about your data. Nanette is a 1. Lots of 3s. Oh, a 2, dig in. This is great. So people are kind of all over the place. Oh, but I think I'm seeing kind of a majority of 3s, and that's totally okay. I fully understand. I often feel that way about my own data. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for intriguing us and selecting an animal photo. All right, so now that we're all identifying with, but do I have to? We can get started with Q&A.
I love it. I love it so much. And I see all of you sucking up with your 3s and 4s and stuff. I'm a 1. Be proud. Be proud to be like, I just can't data today. All right, so we're going to jump in to a few questions. We also, I have a few questions that our team has put together. Kevin is also going to jump in a bit and ask a question or two. And then other folks who have prepped for this, we look forward to hearing questions from you as well. So let's jump into the deep end. So we have a question from one of our participants from last year who wanted to know what advice you would give for folks that may be at universities that don't have the type of infrastructure that Berkeley does. So where they don't have that support for their data management, data storage, or research platforms, or maybe they haven't built out as deep a bench or system to talk through data security. What would you recommend? What are first principles if you are in the desert?
I'm happy to sort of start off. I think, well, I think in general, you know, a really good resource, regardless of where you are, is your fellow colleagues. Those of you, you know, in your different disciplines, or, you know, maybe in a cross-discipline area, or, you know, an interdisciplinary area. I think that's always sort of fundamental, is sort of what's the community doing? How are, you know, what advice could you get from someone who's maybe had a couple more years in the field from you around data management? Because there is very much a practical element too. There's best practices, there's things you should do, but I think really having that connection to the community and the domain expertise of your colleagues is a big thing. So in that way, hopefully no one feels alone because they have a cohort of some size. I would say, you know, one of the other things I'll quickly mention, and I think we brought it up in our slides, but is, there are sort of ongoing consortial resources that can be available to you, depending on whether or not you're at an institution that has, for example, a high performance computing setup. So the ability to, use infrastructure to, if you have data that's larger than your laptop can handle, how can you get access to those resources? And so the one that comes to mind is it's sponsored by the National Science Foundation. It's called, the acronym is EXCEED. I can put in the chat, but it stands for Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environments. And that's something, oh, speaking of books, the cat, that's something that is available to folks regardless of whether, what institution you're at. I think, and Chris can speak, I think, a little bit more to this as well. You're able to get either computing time, or you can apply for, kind of mini grants to be able to do some of the work that you need to do. So I would encourage looking at consortial resources in your area or your discipline. But yeah, that's the first things that come to mind.
Chris, did you want to jump in there? Oh, Anna's jumping
I'll
in there.
jump in. I have a very short point. I really echo Erin's sentiment. What we've seen is that practice is also vary quite a bit from discipline to discipline. So starting within your discipline is a really great idea, because it'll ground you in what people who publish in similar journals, people who are funded by similar agencies. So it builds a good community of practice where you know that you're really on the right track within that discipline. Earth sciences is going to be completely different from demography.
Yeah, nothing to add on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so two questions together. So I'd love to know, what are the most common questions you get from researchers with regards to your areas of expertise, and what are the most common problems that you encounter from researchers? And I've asked my spouse to.
You just got muted, Nanette, but we know where you're going with that cat.
I said I wanted to make sure I brought my cat on camera also, since I saw another one. So most common problems you encounter from researchers with regards to data, and most common questions that you get.
I'll start with a common question that I get frequently that's really fun to answer. It's about data publishing. So we'll frequently get asked, my journal publisher is asking me to share my data, or the NIH or the NSF is asking me to share my data. What does this mean? What does this look like for me? And we've put some resources in the handout for actually publishing, which is kind of like the next big step of sharing and really putting your data out there. But that's a very common question that we get. And it's something that I like answering because we have a lot of infrastructure in place that enables folks to share and ultimately publish their data to adhere with either funder or publisher requirements.
I guess in terms of questions that I receive at the moment, and this because, kind of getting into what Chris talked about so well, like a lot of what I receive at the moment are data security related questions. And that's sort of the nature of how, at Berkeley, especially the research data management program has developed into really kind of filling, I think, what we've seen as a gap between, the researcher and then what they're expected to do because of policy, because of requirements, especially around something like data security, which can be so intense and complicated and vary so much depending on who's asking. So I get a lot of questions from people that are, actually, there was one that came in yesterday that said, we're being asked to create a data security plan. Probably a little bit of what does that mean? And then also, how do we fulfill that request from this particular, I think, if it's a funder or if it's an organization that they're getting data from. So a lot of those. And then I would say, prior to being at Berkeley, some of the questions that I would receive would be kind of just the from research labs who were coming and saying, look, we know we need to have a little bit of better data management practices. What are some simple things we can do to kind of get started with that. And so a lot of discussions around like, oh, well, where are people storing their data? Is there a way to get everyone to put it in one place? You know, those sorts of things. Yeah, I would say those are kind of some of the common ones that I think of off the top.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, kind of onto Erin's point there, that we do get so many questions about these data security and what people are responsible for, and we also get those even from departments and schools and colleges. And so this might be another kind of community you might reach out to when you're trying to find out, like, well, what is going on? Often, you know, some of the departmental IT people, if you have people who do computer support, they're probably wrestling with this as well. So those might also be allies or people who've discovered other kind of solutions and resources.
Thank you. So I'm going to introduce Kevin, who's going to ask our next question. Kevin, you'll note that there are 3 questions in green on our shared sheet. So why don't you start with the first one?
Yeah, so pertaining to the first one, what are some of the most common digital threats to researchers? To the research of researchers.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. That's a really great question. And it's hard to answer because there are so many different kinds of threats to data, to digital data. And, you know, there's a lot of focus on, you know, things like hacking and ransomware, and those are very serious. But I'd like to just remind us that some of the most common threats are just mistakes and accidents, dropping a laptop, you know, spilling coffee on a keyboard, and physical theft is still a very large issue. Even if somebody isn't, you know, trying to steal your data, if they're stealing your laptop, they're taking your data with them, right? So don't forget about those things, you know, the accidents and the physical theft. But in addition, what I'd say is that on the kind of digital side, the kind of hacker side, you know, the attacks are just getting more and more sophisticated. It used to be you could easily tell an email, a spam email that was trying to, you know, get you to divulge your identity because it would be very poorly written. But now, you know, we've got organized crime, you know, across the globe involved in developing very sophisticated attacks, developing things like deep fakes so that, you know, you might see a video and think that you know exactly what that is, but it's really, you know, computer generated. So, you know, unfortunately, we have to be kind of paranoid. And this is, you know, I'm sure you're all familiar with even on social media, the kinds of things that we see. We need to really be kind of pushing for authenticity and verification, and just being aware that those threats are out there, and they will continue to grow because it's just so profitable. Erin and Anna, do you have anything to add on the kind of threat landscape?
No, other than, you know, it can, I think, feel quite overwhelming, which is, you know, one of those things of being kind of the borderline between being aware and then also, you know, kind of recognizing that, you know, you're responsible for what you can do. And then there's a degree to where you're like, look, I can just try and implement the best thing that I can do. So yeah, try not, it's easy to say, but as much as it is overwhelming, try not to be overwhelmed too much.
So I appreciate this point in particular, because one of the many conversations that the group of us have had beyond, you know, where I should store my giant data set and how to put together an appropriate workflow for the world's largest data set. I'll tell you all that this data set is so large that one of the members of the team did this when I mentioned how big it was. We've also talked, because the building where my office is actually at Berkeley caught on fire. So myself and a lot of other researchers that are in that building, which is the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, which houses most graduate students of color on our campus, a lot of us lost you know, data, information, laptops. So, you know, this stuff is particularly important. You just never know whether it's going to be a digital threat, a physical threat, but so important. All right, we're going to jump into some of our questions from the field. I can see one person on my screen right now. I don't know if they're the first person to put their hand up, but it's Nayanthara. So please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for uploading those videos. I learned so much about data management as well as security, which I didn't even think about. So my questions are going to be directed to Erin and and Anna here. So I have two questions. The first one is about restricted data. So if the data is restricted and it can't be reproduced, what, in your opinion, are the best ways that we can still maintain the integrity of the project without like being able to reproduce it? And my second question is mostly like on a more practical note. I work with co-authors in like different institutions as well as across the globe, and they may not be tied to an academic institution. So what tools would you recommend for sharing and storing data when working on these kind of projects? And I also had like a subpart to that question, is that can Zenodo be used before the paper is published by co-authors or no? I was a little confused about that. Sorry for so many questions. I will let you guys answer this. Thank you again.
I love these questions. And I really hope that Erin and I have slightly different answers, because I think that'll highlight that there's no like one silver bullet for these types of questions. So in regards to restricted data that can't be reproduced, I believe your question was around workflow and still putting what you can out there. So I think this is where it's really important to have the citation and the version of the digital object identifier of the data that you used. If it is something that's in a repository that people need to get permission or perhaps go through a training to be able to get access to, as much information about who generated the data, when it was generated, why, where it's located, and how people can request access, as much of that you can put out there, you need to do so. Also, I think there's a huge amount of value in putting out your methods and your code for analyzing the data so that your process is entirely transparent, so that that process can be replicated on, say, maybe a similar data set, or if someone is able to also get access granted to that data set, they can then replicate or utilize the methods and the procedures that you used to look at the data. In terms of your question about co-authors and sharing data and storing data, I'm going to let Erin answer that one. But I will say that I'm a very big fan of Zenodo, and you can embargo deposits on Zenodo for certain periods of time. I think it's a great tool that's very flexible. You can keep GitHub repositories private on Zenodo. So any coder methods can be embargoed until you're ready to put it out there, along with any data that may have been uploaded. So absolutely, it's a great tool to use, even if you're not yet to that publishing stage. Erin?
Yeah, so I don't really have anything to add around the what Anna mentioned about the restricted data question, except for the piece that, they're usually, and it's worth exploring if there's some sort of maybe limited, there's a terminology called limited data set. So certain identifiers are removed, so it's less sensitive than perhaps the full data set. And so if there's any ability to kind of share that piece of it, then that's something definitely that I think we generally encourage. But to Anna's point, I think this is where documentation really comes into play. If you're able to kind of document, you're able to share, the code or the scripts, if that's part of your workflow and your methods. I think all of that really goes a long way. And it's frankly is really a lot more than I think many folks end up doing when it comes to some of this, because it is challenging. So there is that, what Anna said about Zenodo. And so I would say, and I believe what I remember from that second question is, if you're outside of an academic setting, what are some kind of resources and access you have to different tools? It is a challenge, and this is one of those blind spots for me now, being in academia for so long, where I have to kind of remind myself what is available to people when they're not in this setting. And so one resource specifically that may be familiar, and we can put a link in the chat, is Open Science Framework. It's OSF is the acronym, right? So I see Nanette nodding. I think people are familiar. So I would say that that's generally a good resource. Now, of course, I say that with all the added kind of caveats of, be careful what you share there, be careful that you're not putting things that are, identifiable and those sorts of things. But I think that has been a really great resource for folks that are, working collaboratively and that need, a space to be able to store data, documents, and be able to publish, sort of a project as a whole. So I often feel like I go to that one for as an alternative to some of these others. You know, and you do, you know, have the ability, I think, you know, as everyone knows, to access some of the cloud storage around Drive and Box and Dropbox, but, you know, just the big caveat with those as a individual outside of the university is, of course, being careful about the terms and conditions, what data you're storing there. It's a little bit of a challenge. And I'm trying to think if there's any others that come to mind. I may have to, they may generate as I think about it, but I think that's what I have.
Kevin, can you jump in and ask your next question that's in green there?
Yeah. Just wait. So for those who are unfamiliar with the IRB protocols, can you explain why is it so important, and also explain why getting research data stolen on the dark web, like the data discussed on our day one ethics exercise, is risky? And under what situations would be okay to use data or not in your opinion, or not in your opinion, or should it just never be used?
So I think he was asking about stolen data that shows up on the dark web. Is it okay to use that? And we have a mix of experiences in the room. So not everybody requires IRB for their research. So I think it would be helpful to help us center our work around that and its importance.
Okay, thank you. Great question, Kevin. So one of the nice things about an IRB protocol, so probably many of you are familiar with kind of the structure of an IRB protocol and the process and how it's used to gain approval from your university to do human subjects research. But one of the benefits is that it kind of forces you to do that documentation and that planning, both about your methodology, document your risks to your risk to subjects, to privacy, to confidentiality. And then, you know, there's a whole section on how you're going to protect privacy. So that really gets kind of to the heart of data security and kind of confidentiality is like, what are you going to do? You know, are you going to, you know, develop like a pseudo identifier and then have a key file so that your subjects are, you know, their identifying information is stored someplace else, and you can, you know, really make sure that that file is encrypted very carefully. So an IRB protocol is really helpful in developing a plan. I guess what I'd say that in terms of the risks that and the damages that occur when data are stolen are that, you know, you might put these people and communities at some kind of risk, whether it's identity theft or just misuse of the information that you've gathered. You know, you're gathering your information for your research project, and you know all the ins and outs of those data. You know, what's dirty data, what is qualitative data, what the state of your data are, and how you're taking your data through the process of discovery to findings. You don't want somebody else to jump in there and say like, well, I'm going to use this for my own purpose. Well, maybe you do, but maybe you don't. You would like to be able to manage that conversation, right? So really, it does depend on the context of what you're doing. You have collaborators, but you'd like to make sure that people aren't, you know, taking the data that you're in the middle of working with and using it inappropriately. So that might, you know, relate to risks to the subjects, to the communities that you're working with. The other thing that does is it undermines trust, right? So people that you're working with, the communities that you're trying to understand, and you know to the ends that you're working with, you know, they're giving you information about themselves based on a trust relationship. And when we break that trust, it leads to all sorts of problems, not only with those communities, but also with funders and with universities and colleagues and collaborators. So now in terms of that question about data on the dark web, that's really interesting. I think I would be very suspicious of anything that was generated and put on the dark web, knowing that sometimes the data that we're also trying to gather are not easy to get to through kind of official channels. So I can imagine there being legitimate reasons to use that. But I would be, you know, pretty careful and suspicious, and really want to understand, make sure that that's relevant to my research question. I think that's what I would say there, Kevin. So that's a really interesting question that I'll look into further.
I'd like to add just a little bit. I know some of you may have not had to work through an IRB before. It's the Institutional Review Board. And Chris, you mentioned a key word there, which was trust, and having trust with your subjects. And the Institutional Review Board is there to do a really rigorous review of how you're collecting data, who you're collecting it from, where you're storing it, what you're going to do with it, just to make sure there are no adverse effects on your subjects. And my first interaction with the IRB, it was a very small library study on how people use ebooks. And I was surprised at really how devoted they are to that trust building and making sure that nothing is compromised down to their ability to check out a book at the library. So it's a part of any institution that I think is really on your side to help you make sure that you are able to fully develop that trust. As for the dark web question, the first thing that comes to mind, I've never had this question before, but there's a context and story behind every piece of data. Like I said earlier, who gathered it? Why did they gather it? When, where, all of those questions. And if you're looking at data on the dark web, you probably don't have access to those answers. And so it's, we think about data as some data as being quantitative, but in my mind, it is all highly contextualized. And that's an important part of using data and knowing how to use data.
All right, we have our next question from Grace. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question, Grace.
Hi, I had a few questions. First, well, I'll say all the questions and you can answer them as you see fit. At what point should we publish our data? Should it be before publication, after publication? And how valid are some concerns about people swooping our data or going back in and reanalyzing it to kind of critique us? And to put this in context, a few months ago, a graduate student who was a woman, and I believe a woman of color, published some paper and a lot of people didn't like it. And so some other faculty members, usually men, they went in and they reanalyzed her work and tried to tell her that she was doing something wrong. And so I'm just really worried that I might be a target. And then I was also interested in how licensing works for uploading your data and survey materials online. I know OSF gives you an option to license your data. And is that something that we should consider doing?
There's a lot there. So in terms of publishing data, it's fine. Well, you need to look at what your publisher requires for an article that you're publishing. They may want you to publish your data just for the peer review process. Most people who are publishing their data opt to publish it in coordination with a paper being published so that the two can kind of be connected. But there are plenty of researchers who put their data out there without a published paper attached to it or without a presentation attached to it. So there are no hard set rules for when to publish, but there are kind of some guidelines to think about with the trajectory of that body of research. I have a really hard time answering this question about scooping because there's so much nuance to it. And you brought up the attack, which is absolutely awful. And I know is something that that people are dealing with all the time. My thought with scooping in general is that cheaters are going to cheat. And the people who are stealing data, they might be using it even after you've published it and they opt not to cite it. And those are the types of researchers who are going to do crappy things to other researchers, regardless of the license that you put on it or whether it's published or not. So there are always bad actors within this space. I do think there's an element of putting your data and your work out there that makes it more rigorous. That makes you think, what am I putting out there? What kind of critique could it get? And this is really good for me to hear today because I've always had the mindset of putting it out there opens it up to some critique and can make it better and can improve science and research. But then you're bringing up the point of really being attacked because of who created it. And so I don't know, I have a hard time answering that. I don't know, Nanette, Erin, or Chris, if you have any thoughts on how we can protect those researchers and what to do in that kind of situation.
I will just jump in and echo her point that it's something that crosses my mind often. It feels like right now in this environment, it doesn't take much for women and academics of color to become targets. One of our speakers that's coming up, Safia Noble, who wrote Algorithms of Oppression. She and I chatted recently, and I don't think she'll mind that I share that an association started tweeting at her after her book came out and logged a direct criticism on what was written on the book jacket. They didn't take the time to read the book. Our community, Black Twitter, came to her defense, and the person took it down. And I think it garnered great respect that there are all these other academics, especially, that came to her defense, and it changed the conversation. So I don't know if there's anything built in to protect us, but I know that spaces like this, communities like this, that this is where we build up our capacity to support each other. And if you didn't see my comment in the chat box, Grace, I wrote that you dropped the mic, picked it back up, and dropped it again. That was a great question. If they come for you, let me know. Okay. Any more answers to that question before I pass it over to Asha? Anna, Chris, Erin?
Well, I'll touch on the licensing piece briefly, because the thing about licensing, so I would encourage using a license, I think, if available, because at the very least, what it does is it in a space where, we have in some ways limited control over things once they leave us, being able to say, this is this is direction that you give others to be like, this is how you can reuse it. This is, what's available. As Anna said, folks can pretty easily, kind of blow past that and not, adhere to the license or adhere, or cite. But at the same time, it's that sort of best practice of showing this is the way things should be. And this is something that we can do, is kind of making it clear, with a license, it's a way of, just making it clear what can or cannot be done with data. And I think that's important. I think that's how, sort of the standardization of it will grow as well, is people doing it, people using that mechanism, getting kind of familiar with different licenses and what they allow and what they don't allow. I think that there's a lot of power in sort of that kind of almost grassroots level of researchers just doing it, and then it goes from there. So that would be my answer to that piece. But yeah, echo what Anna said, and then Nanette, I think communities are really where it's at when it comes to some of this. And it's not really, it's not fair, but it's definitely something that we have power over, is building that community to support us when we need it.
And we just have such incredible librarians at Berkeley, but I'll say at the University of Buffalo, where I was an undergrad, I feel like nobody goes into, becoming a librarian because they don't like talking to students, and getting deep into the weeds of research. And so I know our library has a 24-hour chat box on the website, and I use that all the time. I'm like, hey, what you doing? I have a research question. Where are you? Why are you still awake? So please take advantage of the incredible librarians at your institution. So we're going to open it up. Asha has the next question.
Thank you, everyone. And I especially liked what you mentioned about, there would be people who would attack or who would do wrong things in this space, something that is, I have not heard before anybody talking about, especially in the research world. And you as a student feel everything is fair and nice and every researcher is great. So thank you for sharing that. My question is, I usually work with children and families and collect custom-made survey data. And one question I get asked from my respondents is, how long am I going to keep this data? Once publication is done, why do you need this data? When will you discard it? And I never have answer for this. Is there any guideline or any suggestion, or if we want to discard, how long do we keep it? 2 years, 7 years? Yeah.
Well, I get, sorry again, she's back, Books is back. It's a great question. And again, another sort of challenging one in terms of the retention period. So, I'll say the things that, sort of are easy to say, which is that, the funders, or if your research is being funded, I saw your comment, sorry, Nanette. Yes, it's true, on the nose. If your research is being funded, often there's some guidance that people provide, that the funders can provide, or again, your community provides. I think in some cases, there's definitely the need to retain the data for as long as you will need it to do the research you're doing, and that you can make very clear to your participants and those who are you're surveying or you're working with. I think, otherwise from there, I've heard anywhere from 3 to 6 years as kind of a best practice. Again, none of that is really, it feels a little arbitrary to say that, but that's sort of it. I think the big thing though is kind of making the decision about it up front, making that clear, and then having a plan in place to get rid of it. Because often that is when sort of the ball gets dropped, is people will say in studies like, oh, after 5 years, I'm going to remove it from XYZ, but then 5 years passes. Understandably, people either forget, they've got other stuff going on, and then it doesn't happen. And so I think, back to almost that conversation about trust, it's important to, if you're going to put a hard limit on your retention of the data, then you need to really follow up on that in terms of having it be removed, deleted, however, destroyed in whatever way. So yeah, I'm sorry that I don't have a great solid answer for for the retention piece, because again, it varies so much. And that is honestly a discussion, even at the UC system, we just are working on trying to put in a, UC wide, can you imagine, research data policy. And the question of retention has been an ongoing one of, I, as a service provider, would love to have an answer about how long it should be so that I can communicate that. But there's all these challenges around deciding on making actually what that should be. So it's an ongoing question. At this point, I would say just if you, kind of make a decision about it, then just kind of sticking to that is the biggest thing you can do.
When you mention, Erin, an entire system-wide policy, I'm just imagining the bureaucracy. It's so much bureaucracy. So I have a policy question. When you ask for researchers to pressure the university, or let's say the system, to adopt a clear policy, what do you mean by that? What are some policies that might generate confusion that researchers might want to speak up about or raise caution against?
Yeah, I think that was a point I had on one of my slides that really I think researchers at all levels, undergraduate, graduate, postdoc, faculty, are really the voices that can help change things, right? When we in libraries and IT units, try to develop services to kind of fill gaps and things like that and help people, we're only successful if we have researchers clamoring for solutions, right? So part of this is asking you all to be advocates and to help us to develop, to improve things on our campuses. On the policy side, policies are written by policy writers, and those people have a certain worldview and and a certain kind of language that they use. So often, I'm sure you read policies and I'm not sure I even understand this. And it's up to us, and in this context, you all, to help to tell these people, I don't understand that. Like, what am I responsible for? Now, sometimes this comes down to actually, most often it comes down to the implementation plan. So a policy has to be of a certain kind of structure in a certain very formal language with definitions. But implementation plans are when it gets down to like, what's really going to happen? Like, what are you actually going to make me do? So, I think, you're all very busy people, but paying attention when say a research data policy is being implemented or new security policy, and telling people like, hey, I don't know what I'm responsible for. How can I actually, fulfill whatever is in here if I don't even understand what the language is? So part of this is just really, saying, like, I'm sure Erin and Anna would agree that we find that the most benefit comes from when we have people like you saying, I don't understand something. You need to clarify this for me. And this is the impact. I can't do my work. I'm having to use a service over at a collaborator's university in order to store my data. those kind of things those stories go a long way.
So I know Chris is a person who has an interest in and appreciation for privacy, data security, cybersecurity. We've talked about some of these things, and there's at least one other person, I know Andrea is in the room, who also studies privacy and these spaces. So I have a question that sort of hangs out in that space a little bit. So there seems to be, there is quite a bit of variation in data security requirements. So IRB, et cetera, across institutions, and there's state laws, and there's like GDPR now and other laws. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the legal, what your institution is required to comply with, versus ethical or moral obligations of the researcher? And I'm throwing this at you, especially Chris, because I know that you were one of the folks in this room with a PhD, and from Berkeley. Am I correct? Is it anthropology? Am I correct? Yes. So I know you see this from so many different angles, and I'd love if others would weigh in. But yeah, we'd love to know what you think.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and this is where I'll say that all these policies and these regulations and these frameworks, they're really they're trying to put things in boxes, right? Your data are at Berkeley. We have P1, P2, P3, P4. We have these levels of data classification that are about kind of the level of risk, and so that's really trying to box in what we know as social scientists is a much messier and more complicated and nuanced world. We're talking about people and social problems and history and context and power. Those do not fit easily into boxes. So that's where really, working with your community, the communities that you're researching, your collaborators and your fellow students and faculty is such a powerful tool to understand, okay, what are the real issues and risks here, right? So, I think that's the lens that I really encourage, and where this intersects with like the information security field is the notion of risk. And I've actually found that the information security people have this really great kind of methodology about risk assessment that is really nuanced, right? And I've learned a lot from studying some of the security literature about how to do risk assessment. And that's helped me understand how to do a more kind of formal assessment of a research project or a consultation that I'm involved in. So you can, on the advocacy point, you can help explain to our university administrators and such why this is actually really hard and why the boxes sometimes don't fit.
Erin or Anna, did you want to weigh in before I open it up to Susanna? Okay. I'm thinking of that famous Neil deGrasse Tyson quote about how, when you move towards sociology, economics, anthropology, or things that involve people, how that's when things get hard. Physics is easy in comparison. Susanna, next question. Jump in.
Hi, thank you for this. It has been very helpful. I have a question. In my research interest is understanding how legal status shapes the health and well-being of immigrants and the children of immigrants. However, studying this is really complicated because most data sets don't ask for legal status. So being an immigrant, I have between two worlds. As a researcher, I have this interest, but I also understand and very well aware, because I have lived through it, that immigrants are a vulnerable population, and I don't want to put them at any risk, particularly those who don't have legal status. So I came across something called Certificate of Confidentiality that some researchers have requested, so that they promise to keep the data confidential and not giving it to the government. So I'm wondering if you have experience with that, and I still feel like I'm worried that I might have to release the data at some point or something like that.
So I don't know if Erin and Anna have anything to add to this. So I'm on one of the UC Berkeley IRB committees, and I'm learning so much. And Anna, to your point about the commitment of those people, the dedication, both the staff in those IRB offices and the faculty who are on the committee and the community members. Wow, it's an honor. It's a privilege to be working with those people. And I'm just starting to see this, learn more about certificates of confidentiality. And I know they come out more, at least my understanding, or where I'm familiar, is that is how they relate to kind of biomedical research and kind of in a clinic, even in a clinical context. And it's the certificate of confidentiality can be, come from one of like the National Institutes for Health. And it basically provides the researcher or the university with kind of a backstop saying like, no, even if with a court order or something like that, I have this document that helps me protect the subjects of my research. That's about as much as I know. I love the idea. I haven't seen it be applied in like a social sciences context. So I'm interested in, Susanna, if you've seen that being done, or Anna or Erin, if you know more about this use within a kind of a social sciences context.
I don't think it's exactly the same. I was just looking really quickly because I was trying to find, it's a very well-known lab out of Columbia University. They analyzed Twitter. One of their projects was analyzing Twitter for mentions of gun violence and sorry, I'm blanking on the name. I have to look it up. But in any case, one of the pieces of that lab that is interesting and it was really sort of fundamental to their work and their research is making clear up front that they will not share data with certain entities, so that their research will not be shared with, I think in this case, and I'm sorry if I'm incorrect about this, but I believe like police bodies, like, we're doing, or, organizations such as, police institutions or any sort of criminal, folks that would, use that data to then incriminate the subjects that they're studying. And so I think that there are, and that is, a lab that does social sciences research. And then there's others, there's another project, I think out of UCLA, that has a similar sort of commitment to not sharing data with certain entities. So I can try and find some of those examples, but I think it's something that I think is present definitely in the social sciences. The degree to which it's sort of formalized as the sort of NIH certificate of confidentiality, I'm not as familiar, but I think it is definitely something, it's definitely something to pursue. It's great that you're thinking about it now before, you're engaging with folks, because then you can kind of put something into place. So yeah, I'm gonna do some Googling, some librarianing right now.
And if there's one of our if there's anybody out there who's a sociologist on this, I'm drawing a blank. There's a famous professor, a woman who studied, it was like inner city crime, and she was present for, according to her book, acts of violence and potentially murder, sale of drugs, things like that. And I'm drawing a blank on her name, but this was definitely discussed in my methods class at Berkeley. So if anybody has if I'm phoning a friend here, if anyone remembers who that is, drop it in the chat box. So fantastic question. And I'm looking at our time and getting sad that we're almost out of time. I think I'd love to throw in one last question. We're going to pretend there isn't 1 minute left. I want to bring it back to like brass tacks and the practical. So so I need to set up a workflow for my data. Like, what is that and how do I do it? Like, I'm just getting started. It's great that there's policies and stuff and that the university's doing stuff, but I am a grad student. I got this data. We've already agreed it's really big and I need a workflow. Like, what is that? What do I do? And how do I help you help me? Final question.
I'll take a stab in like 30 seconds, 30 seconds. One of the things that Erin and I outlined is trying to think about your research, what it looks like before. You might be there right now. What things might look like during, and what things might look like after. What data do you need? What data do you see yourself gathering? And what tools are you going to be using to analyze it? Who are you going to be sharing it with? Writing all of that out in a document that you can go back and edit. These are living documents, they're very dynamic. Write out that plan first, how you see your before, during, and after shaping up. And then as you get into it, go back and edit, add in your file naming templates, add in the names and email addresses of people who you're collaborating with, what, even down to like the security permissions on Google Drive, if you're using that for sharing data, and just keep track of everything. We're also happy to point you to resources. And I think this is also a really good opportunity for you to get in touch with your institution's data librarian or subject librarian. Subject librarians know a lot about this. Erin or Chris?
Yeah, I'll just add, because the data you're dealing with are really complicated, and especially when you're just starting out, you're not maybe necessarily sure where you're going to end up. So starting out with an outline, kind of beginning to end, right? Kind of with the horrible phrase, cradle to grave, like what do you see yourself doing? And then iterate on that, and you'll find yourself changing it, maybe dramatically, and that's okay. Start high level, fill in the details as you create them. So just taking notes on that and really trying to document and looking at those resources, those people like librarians who love the big picture, who love to look at the arc of a project. Those are great resources.
Thank you all so much for your time. I would be remiss if I did not shout out Christina, who put Alice Goffman in the chat box. That is the person we were trying to figure out the name. So helps to phone a friend. Thank you so much. And thank you all, Anna, Chris, Erin, for this incredible conversation. Berkeley Library always comes through. Deeply appreciate it, and deeply appreciate librarians writ large. So for everybody out there, hug your librarian with consent. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.